Thank you for attending the panel today. And I want to also offer my apologies for not being able to speak French. I'm still learning, but thank you for your time. And I want to talk about some of some of the work I did out of my doctoral research at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. So I investigated the roles of spatial presence, particularly the phenomenon known as getting VR legs out of my doctoral research, which is those first few moments a user has or experiences when they try to come to terms with navigating, orientating, or moving through virtual spaces. And I studied it as a type of affective acclimation to virtual spaces. So what I'm presenting today is a little bit from that. So I want to talk about with one of the problems I notice when we talk about virtual design. When I say we, I mean a lot of times designers and developers from my doctoral research, interviewing some of the studios and testing a lot of, let's say, hundreds of virtual reality games. And it's the notion that spatial presence or presence is a matter of technology, that it's a technological achievement. And to quote Michael Abrash, he framed it as presence is an incredibly powerful sensation and it's unique to VR. There's no way to create it in any other medium. I think that phrase leads a lot to debate. And the idea that higher display resolutions and wider fields of view and the absence of the screen door effect are identified as the driving technology in order to create that feeling of being there in a virtual space. I think this language reflects the understanding that technology is positioned as a principal organizing mechanism, and it neglects or subsidizes the role of the body in perceiving space. Even the term immersion that we're using at our conference implies that the virtual space exists before the body's encounter with it. So this sort of sets up a metaphor where we make the assumption that to enter a virtual space is a matter of just having the right equipment, so to speak. So the consequences of that is that it further demotes the body's roles of proprioception, tactility, and temporality as what they contribute to the experience of presence. And I'm adopting a lot of scholarly work that looks at presence as perception as the outcome of a living, moving body that's ceaselessly sensing its way through a world and trying to come to terms with it that exists beyond the borders of its skin. So this work derives from Hansen, who in turn derives his work from Bergson and Masumi on the idea of perception, embodied perception, to be more precise, as an active embodied process that's predicated on movement and sensation. So what I want people to consider is how we approach designing for VR, and particularly how we might be able to leverage affect and bodily modalities to create more compelling experiences of presence. So we consider parts of the VR apparatus that would normally be regarded as technological constraints. The gaps in the VR assemblage or the simulation, the contradictions in stimuli, and even the occlusion of the quote unquote natural stimuli from the sensory organs. So this gives attention to what is present in the user's field that's independent of the technology. The sensory that's happening that's outside of the VR apparatus, and to investigate how these bodily modalities of tactility and proprioception and temporality will shape this experience. So I'm pulling work from Hansen's Affective Body, in which he presents the affective body, or the body's capacity to affect and be affected, as the ideal interface for interacting with digital media. So he offers a different types of phenomenology that's heavily influenced, as I mentioned before, with Bergson and Masumi, to work on effect, and really hones in on this idea of the body being able to experience itself in digital spaces. And so he positions that as the operational mechanism for spatial presence and opens avenues on how we can explore effect and digital media in these virtual spaces. So let's take a look at some of the technological constraints about the VR apparatus. So we know that there is no perfect technology that can capture the millions of sensory receptors that constitute the human body. So at any given time in the VR, there are sensory receptors that are more outside of the VR apparatus than there are engaged with the VR apparatus. And this can also lead to some kind of contradictions, because we know that the forces that are simulated, the virtual forces in the VR world, are made to be representations So they don't always line up with what the body is actually experiencing. Some of the forces like gravity or inertia that the body's experiencing itself is not matching up to what it's experiencing in the simulation. And that repeated or longer exposures to this often reveals the cracks and these shortcomings of the technology that you may not notice on initial observation. And so some of the strategies that are around this that designers and developers have come up with is, well, we can't capture all these senses, so let's target specific sensors, namely the eyes and the ears in the past. And another way to do that is that whatever you're supplying to those sensory organs, to make it more appealing. So it's more colorful, louder, more engaging in some kind of way. And the third strategy is to occlude or keep out natural stimuli from entering those sensory receptors. So even we can see this in the Baker's panorama, the idea of just cutting off the outside world. This strategy is used in cinema. It's used even in Disneyland. The idea of keeping other stimuli or from entering the sensory receptors to, break the illusion of the immersion of spatial presence. This is a particularly effective strategy when we talk about ocular or oral modalities, sight and sound. However, let's take a step back and look at presence from Reba Waterworth and Waterworth's studies that frames presence as a biological adaptation. So it grounds it into biology as an evolutionary response to problems that threaten the individual survival and reproduction. So this idea of we know where we're at, whether it's a virtual space or a real space, is framed as an adaptive solution that an organism develops, that it's able to detect some stimuli and not others. It's able to detect it actively or passively, as well as stimuli on the outside and importantly on the inside of the body. It can differentiate between the two. And that this output presence is a neurological processes that one oversee physiological activity, communicates to other psychological mechanisms, and triggers actions in the organism. So grounding it in this biology, we can look at how spatial presence matters and what's different about it than some of the other umbrella concepts that are, I should say, categorized with presence. So we'll be talking specifically about spatial presence, that feeling of being there in a virtual environment. Now, Lombard and Didden identified about 6 different types of presence along with other people. Scholars over time have always tried to cut the pie in different ways. But I think that there's something very significant about spatial presence, or that transportation presence, is that one, it has a lot of scholarly work that can connect it to biology. And we can connect it to a phenomenon known as distal attribution. If you're familiar with that term, it's the phenomenon of perceiving the external space beyond the borders of the sensory organs, right? The body forms a model, a circumambient spatial model of what it interprets or infers the world to be beyond the range of its sensory organ, its borders of the skin. And that we can understand it as a neurophysiological phenomenon evolved from the interplay of biological and cultural inheritance. So because distribution is a defining feature how the body perceives space, it does play a role in the shaping and experience of virtual spaces. So going back to Hansen points out to 3 bodily modalities that he thinks are important with embodied perception, and therefore will impact how users view or experience virtual space. Now, the first one is proprioception, which is the body's sense of positioning in space, knowing where its limbs are, knowing where its legs are, knowing where it is in relative to volumetric space. The other modality, he points out, is tactility. And he points a lot of this, particularly with the body's encounter with digital spaces. At the end of the day, the computer is made up of ones and zeros. It's incorporeal. It's something outside of the human body, right? It's non-human. So there are times whenever the human and the computer encounter space that we can see these faults. We can see where it's not quite matching up. And he has a particular long analysis of, I believe, Lozario's skulls out of 2000, it's a new media installation piece, where they look at skulls that have been distorted from an impossible or irreconcilable perspective, and kind of points it out how the body can feel its own affective registers working in trying to reconcile this image. And finally, it's a matter of bodily temporality is another modality in which the inaction of space is via sensitivity to changes in intensity over time. So it's a matter of duration, so that the body is constantly regulating, different intensities of affect and the senses and whatnot to try to form this perceptual model. So taking his work, as I mentioned before, he analyzes the Lozario's skulls and points out about how affect becomes a very tactile quality. As I said before, these are skulls that have been 3D scanned, and then inside of a computer, they've been distorted to an impossible dimension. You, like Humboldt's ambassadors, Holbein's ambassadors, excuse me, it appears to be something anthropomorphic. Like if all you have to do is just stand in the right spot, then you will see the skull as it actually should be displayed. But the problem is that spot doesn't exist. It's inaccessible to the human body. Because it was distorted inside the computer space, almost like it's in another dimension or a higher dimension, the body can never occupy the space to look at head on. So it creates this sort of quote unquote weirdness that your affective registers, one becomes conscious of them working and trying to build a perceptual model of space. So we can even test that out here with some of the examples. Now, on the left side, you'll see the Devil's tuning fork, and this has been an optical illusion or conundrum for quite a few centuries. So if your eyes look at the bottom end of the Devil's tuning fork and look at the middle rod, as your eyes travel up it, you realize that what appears to be solid at one end turns into empty space at the other. And your eyes can travel back and forth on that. And what you may notice that it's very difficult for your mind to occupy both those images at one time cohesively. You almost want to either perceive it as a solid or as a space. And you can almost even feel the moment where it flips over, because your body is trying to construct a perceptual model of what it's seeing. On the right side is Fisher's ambiguous images. And what starts up in the upper left corner is a character of an older man, and in the bottom right corner is one of a younger lady. And the idea is that as you start in the upper corner and you travel horizontally across, at one point the image is going to flip over to the young lady. For a lot of people, this doesn't happen until panel 9 or panel 10. The interesting point is that if you do the order inversely, it doesn't mean that you'll see the old man on panel 10 or 9. It may carry over till panel 7 or panel 6 when you notice the flip. And that is because the body has an appetite for form making. It's trying to hold on to a particular image until it can't anymore. Or in this case, there's stronger stimuli or sensory to have it to flip over to this other image. So that brings in an examination of floor space, and that's what I want to get to today. So I want to present the idea that the floor is part of the equation when it comes to spatial presence, that it acts as a passive interface for a human-computer interaction. And so I want to investigate how the floor serves as a framing mechanism for these bodily modalities responsible for embodied perception, and that we can identify some interactive mechanics within the body-computer floor assemblage that may trigger some of these affective responses that may lead to more compelling experiences of spatial presence. So one example is the floor space serves as a shared reference point. So it's often matched up if your tracking is done right. It's usually the floor of your room or wherever you are in real life matches up with the floor of the game space. And this provides a common orientation. That orientation is downward. And we can see in some of the examples like Eye of the Temple over here that they eschew artificial avatar movement in favor of real world user walking. And you can see that the user has to physically walk across this space. He has to take the steps to get from one point to the other. In the other example, we can see where passive feedback is provided in floor space. It's a definitive material boundary. And this is important because most of the objects in the virtual world don't really have a mass. So we have to simulate that, except for a floor. It can be a touchstone for bodily modalities in interaction with gravity and kinesthetics. And it offers a way as a point of contact between the human body in this virtual world, since most users will be playing on a floor. And we can see this really highlighted in the Ritchie's plank experience, in which a real plank is matched up one-to-one to a virtual plank in the world. And this physical plank provides feedback about the stability, about the boundaries, and also provides a direction or a goal. Just get to the end of the plank. And that even stepping off the board, when you step off of 6 inches or however high you have it, it can trigger an intense visceral reaction that you're falling to the ground. And finally, it also frames movement. So standing, crawling, lying, prone, they derive their meaning in part from the relationship to the floor. So postures, gestures, locomotions can be imbued with cultural values. So Tuon's work, a humanist geographer, looked at how the standing human can be associated with alertness or awareness and health, but one lying prone is often associated with vulnerability. As you can see in the example here from Unseen Diplomacy, this type of movement mechanic through the virtual world comes with it different associations. It has certain shared cultural meanings that are associated because of the shared anatomical features. The young man in the picture here is obviously very vulnerable. He can't move very fast, but it's a very different way of experiencing space. And finally, even in the virtual representation, he has to crawl through an air vent. So he has to make really tight corners to crawl around. And of course, in reality, he could just stand up. But the way the game is designed is that he has to crawl through the vents in order to progress through the game. So to wrap everything up, designing immersive experiences around floor space affords opportunities that are inexpensive, ready-made interface available to many VR users. And that designers and developers should consider leveraging the bodily modalities in perception of virtual spaces with floor space in order to increase the intensities of presence and make more compelling and immersive experiences. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'll welcome any questions that come at the end of the presentation. Thank you.